Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome back to the New Books Network. I'm Anna Dijak.
And I'm Brian Hamilton, and we're coming to you today from Deerfield Academy.
We're excited to have the chance to speak with Amy Schiller. She is a postdoctoral fellow and visiting lecturer in government at Dartmouth College and joins us to talk about her first book.
It's called The Price of Humanity: How Philanthropy Went Wrong and How to Fix It. And it came out back in December from Melville House.
Dr. Schiller, welcome to the show.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
This is such a cool book, and it's so lively, and it's so enlightening in all these new ways. I think for many people out there, the idea of thinking critically about philanthropy at all is sort of a new idea. And then for those kind of critiques that I see, it tends to be kind of in the old class war mentality, kind of that we've had talking about it since Carnegie in those days back there. But you offer this really fresh perspective, and you argue that how philanthropy went wrong has to do with a change in how people came to define humanity, what that means, and that change happened a long, long time ago. What do we learn if we approach this problem by starting, as you do, nearly 2,000 years back?
Well, that's a great place to start, not just because it's where the book starts, but because it's the key concept of the book. Philanthropy literally translates to love of humanity. And so the concept of humanity, the concept of humanity really is exemplified in the way that people use resources to support the good that they provide to other people. And so what I do is I go back and I look at a change that happened in the definition of sort of what's the purpose of the money that we now call philanthropy. So we think about philanthropy as both a sensibility and an activity. So the sensibility of how we understand humanity and the activity of using money and other resources to support it. So the shift that takes place is between the sort of ancient Greek and Roman concept of eucratism, where money was used to support the civic life of the city. They were used for institutions that were publicly available, that were accessible to all, that meant to provide a sort of enduring quality of life for the residents of a given polis, of a given place. So it's very territorial, it's very related to community, and just rooted in that sense of embeddedness. Then the shift that happens is when early Christianity comes to the fore, and leaders like St. Augustine are telling the wealthy of their congregations not to give their money to the local needs where they're situated, but to think about giving to the poor more broadly. So it's less about the axis of location and community and more about the vector of need and who's the most vulnerable and who's the most in need. And there's a lot to praise about this, but what that does is it shifts the definition of what it means to love humanity from ensuring a high quality of life for the people that you're in relationship with to a sort of broader, more abstract understanding of people who you don't really know necessarily, who aren't full human beings to you in this portrayal. They are sort of avatars. You're using your money to support basic needs on a conceptual level. You're using money to do good deeds in the hopes that it will not benefit you directly, but will benefit you eventually in the afterlife. So all of this comprises a shift from what I would call a definition of humanity that goes from bios in the Greek term, from quality of life, to zoe, which is bare life or sort of biological existence. And it's in that change that I say, okay, have we come to define humanity and what it means to love it through money too narrowly, to sort of understand we're here to help people survive, but not necessarily to help them thrive. And in that kind of emphasis as we go through history, that emphasis on basic needs and helping the poor and helping the most vulnerable, are we actually dehumanizing people rather than living in sort of full human relationship with them? So the way that I came upon this starting point, this historical starting point, I was describing to somebody how terminology that's used today to describe giving philosophies, the idea of return on investment, giving for an eventual return, efficiency, these terms that are very financialized, they seem new. They seem like they're coming out of our kind of global financial capitalism. But in fact, they have their roots in language that Augustine used when he would talk about giving alms as a method that you would use, like a merchant who sends their goods away to then be returned to him eventually with like financial profit. And that that poor people were porters who brought our good deeds to heaven. So that sense of poor people being the best return on investment has these deep historical roots. And that's what's interesting and surprising and sort of illuminating about language that we use today. And it illuminates exactly that sort of reductive sensibility about giving for return and giving for efficiency, and seeing poor people as a sort of vehicle for generating the best utility and the best return on your investment. And so my concern is really, how do we understand today through the lens of it having these deep origins in the shift of understanding the scope of humanity?
Another new definition of a term that you brought up, used to describe GoFundMe and other large donation platforms in your new book, is performative panhandling. Could you tell us a little bit about this critique?
Absolutely. So my concern about GoFundMe and other platforms is that they essentially are taking some of this objectification and filtering it down to the small dollar level. So these are platforms that we all have access to and we all use. We all can give smaller amounts. But there is a similar trend of looking for the best use of dollars. And in this case, the best use of dollars often comes off as looking for the most sympathetic figure, the most sympathetic story. So it takes what should be provided as matters of right, things like healthcare treatment, things like housing, and it really reduces it to a very sentimentalized appeal. And so my concern about performative panhandling here gets at this sort of larger nexus of how this definition of human life as sort of bare life and looking for things that are the neediest, where there can be the greatest return on investment in terms of the minimum improvement in somebody's quality of life, that plays out at a level that's accessible to all of us, not just at the elite level of Bill Gates, but the things that all of us use to support others. And the sensibility inculcates in us that we're looking for things that spark our sympathies or otherwise kind of feel to us the most satisfying in terms of where we're going to give our money, rather than kind of taking it out of the realm of subjective choice.
You have a great chapter in here on effective altruism, and some listeners might still need a definition of that if you can offer one, but maybe not, because criticisms of effective altruism have been very prevalent over the last 18 months with the collapse of SFX and the massive fraud perpetrated by Sam Bankman-Fried, FTX, excuse me. But your criticism really stands out in how you approach EA through the lens of all things the history of slavery. What do we see when we do that?
So I'll start with the definition of effective altruism.
Thanks.
This is a movement that began as a kind of philosophical approach to giving. And it's an extension of this idea that you want to maximize your return on investment. You want to be giving in the most efficient way possible. It starts with Peter Singer at Princeton, has many acolytes, all of whom are from elite institutions, most of whom, and certainly in the early days, are white and male. And there are a few tenets of this philosophy, and one being that you can quantify the most good that a dollar can do, and that if you were to do any less than the best quantified sort of output of that dollar, you were not giving ethically. And that therefore, if you accumulate the most money, this is really where it takes a turn. If you accumulate the most money in the hands of people who have the tools to sort of determine where it will be used most efficiently, that is the desirable outcome, that it should be, all the resources should be deployed in their sort of most effective use, in this case defined as increase in things like quality adjusted life years. So it really emphasizes the Zoe, the bare life. How can we increase the number of alive, productive years that people have. That's the understanding of what constitutes good. So that's a very quick summary of effective altruism as a philosophy. It took hold in many financial circles with ideas like earning to give, which, again, is that idea of I'm not going to go work at a nonprofit. I want to go work at a hedge fund so that I can make the most money that I can then distribute along sort of these guidelines. There's a lot of hubris built into it. There's a lot of reliance on quantification. It's a very reductive philosophy. So in addition to the many other critiques of its utilitarianism, in which the ends justify the means, best exemplified by Sam Bankman-Fried saying, oh, well, if I just make the most money and I give it to the things that are supposedly doing the most good, that's all justified, no matter the fact that I've embezzled all of it. So the reason I turned to slavery is because what I saw happening in effective altruism was also a focus on pricing human life, like pricing human life as if, as Angus Deaton says, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, pricing lives like used cars. There's a sense of what's the minimum amount of money I need to spend to purchase another year of life or to purchase another life. So again, we just get this extreme expression of the reduction to bare life and to Zoe. And the reason I bring in the history of slavery is because that actually is the moment where the pricing of human life becomes much more codified, and the value of human life, because human life is conflated with property, economic property, is codified into systems that then inform the development of many other very pervasive systems of how we quantify human life. Things like insurance. Life insurance has its roots in slave insurance. It's all the same methodology of how we calculate the value of a human life based on their sort of biological existence and their economic productivity. So I saw the same forces at play in effective altruism, and I thought that was just a way of getting at what might be even more sinister underneath the justification for making the money and giving the money away the way that they did. There's a reduction of human beings built into that I thought needed to be emphasized more.
Talking about the outcome of philanthropy, you say that the most powerful thing philanthropy can do is liberate spaces and experiences from the profit motive and make these benefits available to all. Why is social infrastructure the most important outcome of philanthropy, as you argue? So
that is, I think, tell me if I'm right, from my chapter on Carnegie and libraries. Yes, from chapter 4. It's always helpful when your interviewers have read your book more recently than you have. So I think that exemplifies what I'm getting at there in the form of the library. So the reason I'm so big on libraries is that they are disruptive to the totalizing ambitions of capitalism. The idea that something can be made available for free, that people can exist somewhere for free. I think this is a really frequent lament. I don't know if you guys encounter this, but I think I hear a lot. Like, there's nowhere I can go to just be. I have to go and shop. There's not a place where I can just sit for a long period of time, either indoors or outdoors. We live in a world that's very hostile to us just being in space, especially being in space together, not as consumers, but just as human beings and as citizens. So I think that's a loss for the world. And I think that there's something important about having concrete, enduring reminders that there are, in fact, ways of being in the world, ways of being human that are not consumer-based and that are not production-based, where we can actually experience that physically in an immersive, sensory way. We can experience that with other people. So I see the need for a public realm with things like libraries and parks as the places where we experience that. And through experiencing that, it sort of interrupts how completely overtaken our lives can become by the pressure to be only workers, only consumers, too exhausted to do anything else. We really need spaces and places that reflect back to us the fact that there's much more to human life and humanity than that.
You have a chapter here where you look at what you call the most successful capital campaign of all time. And I'll give listeners a moment to guess what that might be. And the reveal is it's the 24 hours following the Notre Dame fire in Paris there. In the debate that followed about the cathedral's worthiness as a philanthropic cause up against other places that money could have gone, the billions of dollars, right, or billions of euros, you see what you call a consummate example of conflating philanthropy with government. How do we err when we assess giving this way?
So I'm going to address sort of two parts of that question. One being, first of all, that's speculation. I feel like
sure.
speculation.
You had me convinced.
But the baseline narrative is that after the fire in April 2019 that consumed much of Notre Dame Cathedral, there was this incredibly powerful moment that night where a lot of things happened that did bring people together and cause them to really reflect on the importance of this enduring building and this enduring place and what it represented for them. So sort of along the lines of what I said before, Notre Dame really represents the sense of connection to history, to the sacred, maybe not even in a religious sense, but just a place that's really important and uplifting for people to have and to be able to interact with. So the fire happens, the streets of Paris are filled with people singing hymns and praying together. It's this incredible public moment. And in the middle of that public moment, you have major pledges coming in, both at the very, very high level and at the low level. So you have money coming in that is being pledged to multiple nonprofits all night. Very quickly, a kind of system was set up to receive donations that were coming in from all over the world. And you have the wealthiest families in France, which are some of the wealthiest in the world, pledging record-shattering amounts of money, 100 million euro, 200 million euro. They're trying to outdo each other. This is super unusual for France, where philanthropy is much more discreet. They do not really make a big show of it the same way that the wealthy of America do. So it's this very this big eruption, I guess, of money onto the scene. And they raised 2 billion euro in pledges in, I say 24, it may have been 36 or 48 hours, but nonetheless, that's an enormous sum of money to have pledged essentially overnight. So that's the first part of sort of what happens. Now, the second part of what happens is a backlash to that, that says, oh, it turns out that they could just donate 100 million euro or 200 million euro. Why aren't they giving it to causes like poverty and homelessness? And so this whole chapter is trying to detangle what is appropriate about that critique and what is misplaced about that critique. And so much of what's appropriate about that critique is it's pointing at political failure, because a crucial piece of context is that the fire and all this fundraising happens at the same time, essentially, as the Yellow Vest protests in France, major protests over inequality. Macron has implemented tax cuts and austerity measures that have really shrunk the role of the French state. And people are responding in kind with protests and with unrest. So there's political failure that precedes this moment of major philanthropy. And what I thought became perhaps misguided was expecting the philanthropy to solve the problem of political failure or to address the consequences of political failure. And there's a few reasons for that. So this gets to the second part of your question. So one reason is that only reinforces the idea that somehow government is replaceable with private dollars, which is something that we should be resisting. I understand from a pragmatic point of view, you're saying, like, let's just go where the money is. Like, people need to be fed, people need to be housed. I truly do. But I'm a political theorist, which is extremely convenient for saying, normatively, that's not the approach that we should be taking, because it leads to these unintended consequences of kind of equating the two. And in fact, the problem of inadequate provision of basic needs is something that has to be addressed with a political solution, and has to be addressed as a matter of democracy. Why? This sort of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. When we're providing people's basic needs as a matter of benevolence and generosity, and not as a matter of a right of citizenship, it really implements a different power dynamic and a different ability to relate to one another. In one case, we're relating to others as sort of avatars of vulnerability and of dependency, and in others, we're relating to one another as equal citizens who sort of have equal security and stability in their lives provided by the collective enterprise known as the state. So that's why I wanted to get at the sort of misguided nature of conflating philanthropy with government. And the third part was to say, the thing is that there is a unique value to using philanthropy for things like Notre Dame. So we want to restore a balance. And we want to kind of insist on both. Por qué no los dos, as the Beat says. We should have government for our basic needs. And therefore, that would allow philanthropy to do things like preserve the evergreen infrastructure of culture, of the sacred, of history, of civilization in things like Notre Dame.
As you point out, philanthropy is just one piece of a complex tax code that offers dozens of advantages to wealthy people. Why should we switch the reward system of philanthropy from a tax deduction to a tax credit? And further, what is the role of DAFs or donor-advised funds in philanthropy, and how do DAFs affect the capability of our society to address social needs?
Okay, so now we're getting into the weeds of the governance of philanthropy in the U.S. So much of my issue is that we do need to address sort of inequality in our inadequate social welfare state writ large. And these reforms focus on ways in which philanthropy is perpetuating those inequalities, even in small ways. There's lots of big reforms that need to happen. Here are the kind of small tweaks that could happen. So one of my big concerns is that our tax code right now, it rewards giving just for absolute dollar amounts. It's like more is more. So the more you give, the more you can deduct. And in fact, you have to give a fairly high amount annually to deduct money from your taxes. So a household of two people would have to be giving $25,000 a year away just to start deducting above and beyond the standard deduction that every household takes. It's a little wonky, my apologies. But the problem there is that not only wealthy households will see a tax benefit from donating, and that sort of codes giving as an elite activity, something that only really rich people do, that they only get rewarded for by the state. So if you flip it and you say everyone gets a flat tax credit, you then make giving something that's focused on how do we get more people to participate at every level? How can people at every income see some level of benefit and some level of incentive for participating in giving? So it really would just be shifting from rewarding the amounts given to the percentage of participation of people in society. That's the idea behind that. DAFs, that acronym stands for Donor Advised Funds. So donor advised funds are an increasingly popular way of giving money away, but without the regulations we currently have on foundations. So foundations used to be kind of the main vehicle for giving money away if you wanted to do it institutionally. So you would put a certain amount of assets in an account, you would have a board of directors, and then you're required to give, required to give 5% away every year. And you have to disclose your beneficiaries. You have to, again, have all kinds of governance that you fulfill. A donor advised fund is essentially a charitable checking account that you fill, that you sort of start. You can start it with a bank. You can have it at Chase. You can have it at Vanguard. And you allocate whatever money you're going to put into your donor advised fund. And you have no requirements over when you're going to distribute it, or transparency about who you're distributing it to. You don't even have to disclose that you yourself did it. I've worked for nonprofits that have gotten large checks from Vanguard and no idea who was behind that or any way to get in touch with them. So there's huge problems there around transparency and also around sort of the rate of giving. This is another one of those things among many issues with it that makes giving a thing that only the wealthy do. And it really occludes their identities and their obligation to give at a faster rate. It's another way of them getting a tax deduction first, kind of on the front end, without necessarily having to distribute the money at as fast of a rate. So again, it's just another way that the way we govern philanthropy right now is perpetuating the inequality and the glorification of wealth, when I would like to see it kind of celebrate giving as a universal activity that everyone can participate in for building the common good together.
When you point for your readers, when you point them toward philanthropists committed to humanity, committed to, as you say, the whole human, doing this work the way you think it should be done, you direct us to a delightful pairing of Jane Addams and LeBron James. What did their endeavors share in common?
Okay. Well, can I ask you guys, did that surprise you when you read it in the book?
I mean, it's the title of the chapter, so I knew it was coming once, but it was a strange title to see jumping off the page for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm going to assume people basically know who LeBron James is. Jane Addams is the founder of Hull House, among many other accomplishments in her life. She's a very prominent social reformer and philanthropist in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Hull House was the flagship settlement house in Chicago. And I'll get to how she ties in at first, but I want to talk about why I chose LeBron. And I've been excited to write about LeBron like well before I even started writing this book. First of all, I grew up in Cleveland, so obviously I'm a little bit biased. I read an interview with him where he was asked at the school that his foundation funds in Akron. And I hasten to add, it is a public school. It is a publicly governed school, and his foundation funds it in a supplemental way in partnership with Akron Public Schools. So the I Promise School, among the things that his foundation provides is that they give every kid a bike and a helmet. And when asked, why does he do this? He said, when I was a kid, having a bike was what made me feel free. That has stayed with me for years. That's an ideal of humanity that says, you don't have to necessarily perform for me. You don't necessarily, I don't need a metric to show your improved performance in school or somehow get a return that satisfies me and my need for reassurance. I'm genuinely interested in giving these kids autonomy so that they can flourish on their own. That seems to me one of the highest forms of humanity. So that stayed with me as an ideal, and that sort of fleshed out in a number of other ways that I think LeBron and his team approach philanthropy. Where Jane Addams comes in is she was maybe even more explicit on this point. When she founded Hull House, she was very clear that she wanted it to be a place of beauty and leisure and recreation in the middle of these slums in Chicago where there were immigrant populations, laboring populations. And her concern was that industrial capitalism had such a chokehold on their lives that they had no opportunity to just be full human beings together, to have music, to have education, to have conversation. And that was really the purpose of Hull House. It was not to meet basic needs. It was to help meet basic needs, yes, but in ways that met these people in their full humanity and enabled them to flourish. So she's very clear about that as her rebuttal to, again, the totalizing ambitions of industrial capitalism and the need for beauty as a democratic project.
Thank you. So you talk a lot about these non-utility aspects of life and giving people bikes, giving people things to make their lives more enjoyable. So why is it so important to reallocate philanthropy from the basic needs of life back into the non-utility aspects of life? And what are some examples of non-utility aspects or ways that an ordinary person could go about doing this?
Great. So in the last, or I guess the second to last chapter, I describe government for bread, philanthropy for roses. So when you're talking about utility aspects and non-utility aspects, I want to use that as their kind of illustrative binary. So bread here would mean, housing and food security, healthcare, things that just help us live and sort of remain alive. And it's not that I don't think we need philanthropy for those things it right now. I do understand the importance of responding to crises. And so what I say is you want to give some for the world that we have and some for the world we want to build. So just think of it that way, of kind of allowing your giving to not get sucked into absolutist perspectives of what it should be trying to accomplish, and giving ourselves the space to say, okay, what is an ideal world where all kids have bikes, where, workers have spaces for concerts and for lectures, where the highest goods of life are available to everyone? What can I do to advance that? So the non-utility aspects of life, the reason those are important are that those are the things that make us fully human. To go back to sort of our initial definition of humanity, the non-utility aspects of life are flourishing. They are our creativity. They're our collaboration. There are libraries. There are culture and our museums. So we want to maintain a connection to that which makes us human, especially in the activity known as love of humanity.
You close the book with a chapter that considers the physical landscape that philanthropy constructs all around us. And in there, you note that some may see the ubiquity of donor-dependent spaces and places, all the names on all the buildings, all the plaques and all the benches, as dispiriting and sort of an example of the obscene inequality and wealth in the nation at this time. But you say you find it affirming. Why is that?
Well, what I find affirming is when there's a multiplicity of names.
Right.
So it would be dispiriting if it was all like
Mr. Potter
Brian and Anna Center for blah, blah, blah. Like that would be, I mean, you guys are great, but like if you eventually it would become kind of a bummer.
Yeah.
But what is affirming about that is the idea of like lots of people saw this space, this thing as important enough to preserve for future generations. So multiple people wanted to make this nature preserve continue on into the future. This park, this bench, you get a sense of biography. I love park bench plaques where you get a little taste of somebody's personality in their biography. It's a way of staying in touch with the humanity of people who have passed, their desire not just to like have some kind of remnant in our world, but also to, again, preserve those evergreen goods of life for everyone. So I think it keeps us in touch with our own humanity, the humanity of others, and the fact that we are all can and should be collectively committed to a really robust world that facilitates all of our flourishing.
Could you tell us anything about what you're working on now, whether with your students or in your writing?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I continue to teach at Dartmouth. And right now I'm teaching a class on monuments in the American public world, which kind of relates to this because there's a lot of fundraising involved in how monuments and memorials get constructed, and they very much are expressions of value in the physical world. I'm exploring teaching and other partnerships at Tuck Business School and at Penn, at Stanford. Stanford has a philanthropy and civil society program. And all of these will be projects that focus on the question of, first of all, flourishing. Sort of how do we make flourishing an ideal that maybe is kind of a counter to the value of efficiency, making a more full definition of that. What do public spaces do for that? How do we create public spaces and this idea that beauty is a democratic value? And I think another line of thinking I'm exploring is the need to affirm humanity during the rise of AI. So what can this sort of lend to that conversation? What can philanthropy do to affirm what is uniquely human and protect it when there's the rise of so much thinking that kind of flattens us even further into just productivity and algorithm? So those are the things that I'm thinking about and writing about for a number of outlets and at a number of institutions.
So cool.
Thanks.
The book, again, is The Price of Humanity, How Philanthropy Went Wrong and How to Fix It. It's out now from Melville House.
And its author is, and our guest has been, Amy Schiller.
Dr. Schiller, thank you so much for your time and for this book.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for these great questions.